Hello and welcome. My name's David Ashton of Ricks and Kay. I'm joined by my colleague Stuart Gregory. We're both partners in the commercial property team. Today we're going to talk about the return of the rent deposit to the tenant, having in our series lately talked about how the landlord withdraws money from the rent deposit. We're going to cover it from the tenant's perspective on this occasion.
Okay, so thinking of it from the tenant's perspective, if I'm entering into a 5-year, 10-year lease, then presumably as a landlord, you're not going to want to be keeping hold of my rent deposit for the whole of that period. And at some point, we can just agree a fixed date when I can get my money back.
The normal starting point is that the landlord would expect to have security for the term of the lease, just in case there are any breaches at any time. However, I can understand from a tenant's perspective that if the tenant says, I'm a good tenant now, I've proved I'm a good tenant, can I have my rent deposit back?
But presumably, there's more way of showing whether I'm a good tenant. I'm thinking here about my financial strength, because that's surely what's important to you.
Yeah, I think there'll probably be two ways of dealing with it. Firstly, the tenant could say, look, I want a fixed date for when that money is going to be returned to me, say in 3 years' time. However, the landlord would say, well, if you've not been a good tenant, if you've been in arrears or there are substantial breaches of the lease, then I'm not going to be returning that money to you. From a financial perspective, what is fairly common is that the landlord will require evidence that there's been 3 years of profitability and or a good balance sheet in accounts,
Mm,
and those accounts would need to be produced. And the tests are, as we've covered before in the earlier video
mm,
blogs.
mm. Yeah, okay. Okay. Um, so what about then, instead of showing that I'm a good covenant strength, what about if I simply transfer the lease to a third party? So I assign on the lease. Could I get my money back at that point?
Yes, you would expect the rent deposit deed to have a provision covering that very point. The significant things really are twofold. One, that it is a lawful assignment, i.e., that landlord's consent has been obtained in the first place. And secondly, where there is an element of negotiation, is that the landlord will want a provision to say, when I receive notice from the new tenant that there has been an assignment, I will release the money to you, the old tenant. However, that's outside your control as the old tenant. You'd certainly want to have a contractual provision when you are assigning that lease to comply with that. You must have a provision that the new tenant will serve that notice. Or even better, you manage to negotiate in the rent deposit that as long as some form of evidence that you can produce will be sufficient for the release of that deposit to you,
Mm,
the
mm.
tenant.
Okay, so it seems that there are problems either which way in potentially getting the money back during the term. But if the the lease runs its course, and we get to the end of the lease term, then surely I'm going to get my money back at that point.
Yes or no? Yes, to the extent that you would want to negotiate a clause that says automatically you get that money back when the term comes to an end. But often landlords actually ask for a period of time, say 1 or 2 months, following the expiration of the lease, to hang on to that deposit simply to deal with any claim for dilapidations or
Mm,
breaches of the lease. But from a tenant's perspective, of course, you want to avoid such a provision and ask the landlord to provide on all of the other remedies that it has available to it
yeah.
for claiming any sums due under the lease.
Yeah, because the landlord certainly does have a lot of remedies available to it under the lease, and I really, as a tenant, I don't fancy having those arguments about dilapidations before I can get my money back.
Yeah, all down to what is negotiated as far as the rent deposit deed
Mm,
terms.
okay. So finally, then, anything else? Any other way of I might get
The
my
only
money
other,
back?
the only other technical time when you might get your money back only deals with sort of older leases. I'm talking about leases granted pre-1995. There is a provision that, due to privity of contract, that if a landlord were to assign the freehold to another freehold owner at that time, you would get, as the tenant, your rent deposit back, because the new owner of the freehold would want to enter into a rent deposit directly with you. But that's another subject, and we won't go into that now. I think we've probably covered all of the main triggers for repayment, and hopefully in our next video blog, we will be seeing the end of the moratorium against the enforceability of breach of covenants that the landlords are subject to at the moment. So we look forward to seeing everyone on the next occasion. Thank you.